It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, newsbreakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
It was 25 years ago the Vermont Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples are being unfairly denied the rights and benefits of married couples. In response, the legislature created civil unions. In this special edition of 802 News, we look back at the landmark Baker decision. Here, in Part 1, plaintiffs Stan Baker and Peter Harrigan discuss that tumultuous time and the vitriol they and others endured. In Part 2, Tom Little, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee in 2000, talks about getting the historic civil unions bill passed and the political backlash some 24 lawmakers faced from groups like Take Back Vermont. First, a word from our sponsor, Red Hen Baking Company. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. The day the decision came out, I know there was a lot of celebratory feeling, but it wasn't really the full approval of gay marriage. It really was acknowledging that there were rights and benefits and privileges that gay couples were being denied, but they really didn't do the full gay marriage and then kicked it to the legislature. Was there any disappointment you felt as a result of that?
Yes, that was an amazing day. It was December 20th, and we had I say us, the other four plaintiffs, Lois and Holly and Nina and Stacy, and the three lawyers, Susan and Mary and Beth. We'd been waiting and finally got word that they were going to hand down the decision. Once it was handed down, we had mixed feelings because, as you said, we had not been given marriage by the court, which was our great hope. There was beautiful language written up by Judge Amistoy about the need for same-sex couples to have all the rights and benefits and responsibilities of opposite-sex couples. It was beautifully written. In some ways, in that way, we won in terms of the sense that we were entitled to the same rights and responsibilities. But the court did not give us marriage and handed it to the legislature. And I remember clearly the three lawyers, Mary and Susan and Beth, saying, "Whoa, we've got to read this as fast as we can so we can then meet together with you guys and the plaintiffs and some of the other grassroots people from Freedom to Marry to determine what it says and what we'll do next, what will be the next steps."
There's also just an element of surprise because we were expecting that we'd win, but we thought there were two possible outcomes that, we would win or we would lose, and here was this other option. I'm not sure if it had been used before or since, but it was an unusual thing that the court did.
Peter, did you feel as though they kind of punted?
I don't know. I feel like they maybe thought that a deeper conversation needed to happen before laws were changed or created.
It's always, looking back is different than the time itself. Looking back, strategically, it may have been a good thing that it got punted to the legislature and that they coined the word civil union rather than domestic partnership and created this in-between thing, because some have said, people that I respect, that they don't think that the legislature would have been able to create marriage at that time given the political climate, and that the civil union step was a way for people not only in Vermont but nationwide to get used to the idea of some kind of legal status for same-sex couples. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly the people who say that I respect. At that point, though, it was, as we said, a mixed bag. for sure.
Yeah, I remember Beth Robinson, who then went on to become a member of the Vermont Supreme Court, saying that this was really inadequate.
Yes.
That they really should have done full gay marriage.
Well, and as we were all said at that time, and many times after, it's separate but equal, and separate but equal is never equal.
Yeah, and Peter, in fact, you said that day, you talked about interfaith and interracial marriage and how that was frowned on. You said, now we say that's ridiculous. How could people think that? In 50 years, we'll be saying that about same-gender marriage, so why not say it now? Here we are, 25 years, half of that 50. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that comment today, 25 years later?
Well, it's interesting in terms
Besides being brilliant.
Of course. The timeline is an interesting thing because the 25 years passed very slowly in some respects and moved very quickly in other respects. It was 1949, I think, that the California Supreme Court first allowed interracial couples to marriage, and then 1969 before the U.S. Supreme Court addressed that. So I guess we're in roughly the same time frame. I don't know. It's also a little strange, and we don't necessarily need to dwell on this, but it's a little strange now, 10 years after the Obergefell decision, to be questioning whether that will hold up. Yeah. Because, in terms of unanticipated outcomes, I think once something gets established as a right, you assume that it stays a right.
You're talking about the right to gay marriage itself. Yeah.
And on the day...
We'll get back to that, by the way.
On the day of the election, we both got people calling us and saying, will we be all right? Will our legal relationships survive? What's going to happen? Of course, I don't have a crystal ball. My guess is we will be, but I think we need to continue to champion the cause of same-sex marriage. I think far from hurting opposite-sex marriage, it actually enhances it. It actually strengthens it. And I think that same-sex marriage also shows that relationships can be more equal, that the way that we parse out the jobs in a relationship can be more equal. So I think they've really shown opposite-sex relationships how to have a relationship that is actually more equal and stronger as a result.
Going back to 1999, there were a number of comments that came out the day of the decision that I look at and, as somebody who's not gay, find hurtful. Mm-hmm. What about you two?
I don't remember. I'm sure things were said. It was interesting. I put together a talk that's available through Vermont Humanities about that period of time, and it was interesting to go back through newspaper articles particularly and see all of the little sort of steps along the way that I had forgotten. The movie The State of Marriage, watching it was a little bit triggering in some respects because there are we all got through the process pretty well, but there are things about it that were difficult.
Like what?
Certainly things that were said within Vermont, but also outside of Vermont. We were featured on the Fred Phelps Westboro Baptist Church website, godhatesfags.com. We're singled out, really. The female plaintiffs were not mentioned, which I think has more to do with misogyny than anything else. There were moments of uncertainty and even ugliness along the way that it's not something you want to dwell on.
Looking back, I think it's hard for me to separate out what was the fallout from the Freedom to Marry lawsuit in terms of public comment and some of the things that I'd experienced previous to that as a gay man coming out. I think during those 3 years, many things were said. I probably had my first and only anxiety attack then, because when the announcement was made in 1997 about the Freedom to Marry lawsuit. That was, strangely enough, also the time that Andrew Cunanan had murdered Versace, and there were newspaper reports that he was in New Hampshire. I don't know why, West Lebanon, New Hampshire. And I remember that was almost exactly when the lawsuit came out, and I remember coming home and seeing the Bushes move and thinking, oh my God, he's now going to come up here and do us in. I got through that, and that was unique and probably the only time that happened, but it does speak to me of the level of anxiety, or maybe just being very keen on what's happening in one's environment. So I think in my life before, I'd never, when I drove home, checked around to make sure that there weren't people who shouldn't be there, or watched the bushes, or checked outside, or sort of watched my back in a way that I'd never had before. Mm-hmm. So I think that certainly was part of it. The only time that I remember that we were physically threatened was at a time in the auditorium at Castleton State College where we were speaking, and somebody rushed forward toward us saying whatever they were saying, and the security there stopped him right away and took him out. But I don't remember a lot of other times of being physically threatened like that. I do know that certainly we were called all kinds of things. Peter mentioned the Fred Phelps web thing that had under our picture on their thing, Vermont Fag Beasts. And that's, I mean, you can sort of ignore that stuff. On the other hand, you can't ignore that stuff, and it goes in. I remember once being spit on early on, always in the gay pride parades in Burlington. Not anymore, but there used to be a truck, and it was usually parked on Lower Main Street with people who would yell out horrible things at the people passing by. So I think as spokespeople at that point for same-sex marriage, I think we certainly felt that vulnerability. The offset was the incredible support from the Freedom to Marry Task Force and from our three lawyers and the community that was built around us. And I think Beth and Susan and Mary really looked out for us and would sometimes call and say, oh, you need to know this is going to be coming out of the newspaper, or prepare yourself for this. And we got really amazing support as a result.
I think part of this is just trusting that Vermont is the place that it is, and that we will be, sort of held up, if you will, in our efforts, or respected.
I would imagine there must have been some thought that went into even getting involved in this lawsuit. Mm-hmm. How did you move through that?
Well, we had a process. We first heard about the Freedom to Marry Task Force in 1996, and Stan narrated the short video that they made, 17 minutes, I think, on VHS tape. And we thought, gosh, this makes a lot of sense. We really should have access to these rights and benefits. Over time, we heard that there was a lawsuit being formed, and then eventually we heard that it was going to be in Chittenden County because of sort of the rotation of judges at that time. And there were two female couples who were part of it. And so it was almost like a little bit of a sort of matchmaking kind of thing where we met with the lawyers and we all sort of considered things. And then for a couple of months, once we had agreed kind of internally, for a couple of months, we started talking to people in our lives, family members, people that we worked for, and had meetings with people just to sort of let them know that, this was a political action that we were taking. It was very important to us. It was kind of independent of our roles or responsibilities in our work positions. And we just we weren't asking for permission, but we wanted to let them know that it was happening so they wouldn't be blindsided.
When you say it was political, so did you join this to push the cause, or was it that you really felt there were rights and benefits that you wanted in your life?
Both. And certainly we, because we had secure jobs, because we had the support of families and friends, we felt like, we were privileged in some respects, and not everybody, even in Vermont, would have the safety to sort of step forward in the way that we were going to. So we thought we had some obligation.
Did you have anybody telling you don't get involved in this? It's gonna be too much.
I had some friends, even some seasoned gay political friends, who said, "I'm worried. Be careful." Nobody said, "Don't do it." I was then a therapist at the Counseling Service of Addison County. I did lose, working with children and families, I did lose 2 clients over it, which was hard in some ways. I guess looking at the other side, all the other people I didn't lose who were very supportive and either were appreciative of what I was doing or separated me, my work with their families from that issue. I just, the one thing I did want to say, kind of going back slightly to the conversation about the conservative religious press. I don't even know if conservative is the right word. I might say reactionary religious press, which certainly was not all of the religious press, but things like the Westboro Baptist press focused on Peter and me and not at all on the lesbian women. And as Peter said, I think that's a matter of misogyny, in that what women were doing from the point of view of the sort of the white male patriarchal religious press was not as earth-shaking or as important, but what 2 men would do in entering into a relationship, a marriage relationship, was deeply disturbing to the fundamentalist press. And so they focused on Peter and me, and we certainly got more of that than the women did. That they got other things, but that was that piece. As somebody who is a religious person, I don't know if it surprised me, but it certainly was a factor that I hadn't thought about going into it. We went out to a college in Nebraska at one point where Peter had a colleague there, and we were asked to come and speak, which we did. And they were it was a religious college, right?
It's Nebraska Wesleyan.
Nebraska Wesleyan. The students were as interested in the church's response to same-sex marriage, meaning the church we were part of, which is the Episcopal Church, as they were the political response outside of that, which was interesting. They had many, many questions about the church's response.
Were you at St. Paul's at that point?
Yes.
And what was the reaction you got there?
Well, that's one of the wonderful parts of it, I think, for both of us. We were probably only a few months into attending St. Paul's during, not at the beginning of the lawsuit, but during the lawsuit, and the then Dean Ken Poppy asked us if we would preach. So the 2 of us squeezed into that pulpit and preached about, I remember that being about 6 months into our time at St. Paul's.
Probably something like that.
And that was very powerful to be not only in that community, but embraced by the community for the most part. There were 1 or 2 couples who didn't support us. I don't know if you remember, but in that time, there were pink ribbons and white ribbons.
Oh, sure.
And the people who were in favor of or supporting traditional marriage wore white ribbons, and the people in favor of same-sex marriage wore pink ones. And there were 2 couples in the congregation at St. Paul's who came often with white ribbons on. The thing that I really learned from that is that they then, after it, began to realize the sky did not fall, and that opposite sex couples were all of a sudden not going to have the strong relationships they'd had, and one of them actually became quite friendly toward us. So I think people, we've always, the premise of the Freedom to Marry Task Force was tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. And if you start from a place of telling your story and listening to other people's stories, it's a very different conversation. So when we would go out into the world and talk at a library or a church or some kind of a club or somebody's house, we would ask people to tell the story of how they met. Mm-hmm. What is the story of your relationship? Opposite sex people or same-sex people. And when you start from the place of tell me the story of your relationship,
right,
and then you say, now let me tell you mine, that's a very different conversation.
Talk to me about Howard Dean at the time, too. That first day he said, gay marriage makes me uncomfortable just like anybody. How did you react to that comment? You're chuckling, Peter.
Yeah. I don't know. He came around, I guess you could say.
I think the political term is evolved.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it ended up being sort of an issue for him, to build a national platform, although that was not, that was short-lived. I don't know, probably, what's that? Internet talk, SMH, shaking my head. I bet I did a lot of shaking my head that day, sort of, okay, all right.
I think Howard Dean wasn't alone in that sort of, I don't even know if queasiness is the right word, but Barack Obama said something similar. Clinton said something similar. There's almost like politicians at that time felt they needed to somehow only put their toe in the water, but not go swimming yet. And I think looking back, most of those people have said, I was wrong. I wish I hadn't done that. My mother's family were all politicians. I have actually a fair amount of respect for politicians. On the other hand, I am also a realist in terms of what people do to maintain their base. And I think that what we did could not only affect the country, but teach people like the Obamas and the Clintons and Howard Dean and others that this was all right, that you didn't have to be queasy, that it was part of life. I think that to me is very powerful. I've always said that the most radical thing we can do is look at the institutions that we have and make them more equal and more open to everyone. So if you think about voting and when women were allowed to vote, all of a sudden that didn't make voting and participatory democracy less strong, it made it stronger. In the same way, when people of all colors were allowed to marry each other, that made marriage stronger. When we extended marriage to same-sex couples, it made marriage stronger. So I believe that one of the most radical things you can do is go into the institution and expand access to it. I sort of realized that as even in the queer community at the time of the Freedom to Marry lawsuit, there were some people who said, why do you want to get married? It's a heterosexual, patriarchal, old, broken institution. And my answer was something like what I just said, that one of the things we want to do actually is have this. Well, first I would say there are thousands of rights that are accrued to people who are married, and it isn't simply a piece of paper. It has deep legal ramifications. But that I also think by expanding the franchise, if you will, or opening it up, we are strengthening marriage for the world.
How so? I'm curious about this. When you say that it makes, by expanding it, it makes it stronger. How so?
I think when an institution denies access to a group of people, it actually creates a more rigid and less flexible and therefore less strong institution because it's built on a sense of defensiveness or exclusion rather than inclusion.
The next step was the legislature then had to deal with this issue of how to deal with the court ruling. Mm-hmm. The initial discussion was about having a domestic partnership bill. Mm-hmm. I guess, do you see any difference between domestic partnership and civil unions?
Well, we used to joke about it and say that domestic partnership sounded like we were going to clean each other's houses, like we were being hired as domestics. But I actually think, looking back, that the coining of civil union was a fairly, I don't know if brilliant is the right word, but a good direction to go. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, domestic partnership was actually in use at the time in some places. Like in San Francisco, you could go to the city hall and register with your domestic partnership, and that might give you a few local advantages. I'm not quite sure what they were, but I think using that term was not comprehensive enough to look at the bundle of rights and benefits that would be available within Vermont to same-sex couples.
And the Supreme Court decision, Vermont Supreme Court decision, did state that the legislature had to figure out a way that all of those rights and benefits would accrue to same-sex couples. So it wasn't, the intent was not less than on their part, but the intent was equal without using the name. It's interesting when you think about that naming, nomenclature, the power of the name word itself has meaning. And we used to talk about that, as did the lawyers, that the word marriage means something even outside of the large basket of rights and benefits that come with it.
And you know what it is. If something is not marriage, you're not quite sure what that is, but chances are it's probably less than rather than equal to or more than.
Who came up with the term civil unions? Do you remember?
It's interesting.
I'm sure there are 1,000 people now that claim they did.
I remember being on a conference call, on the phone, and I think a woman in White River Junction did, and just kind of mentioned it casually, and maybe it was dismissed or something like that. But I'm not completely sure.
Then the civil union legislation came out some 5-6 months later. What do you remember about that process with the legislature coming up with this bill now 25 years later?
Well, I remember we were all called to a meeting in Montpelier at the office of the lawyers.
The folks who were lobbying for us.
Right. And the lawyers and others were saying, it looks like here's what the bill is going to be. Do we go with it or do we not? Because we could have at that point, we being the plaintiffs and the lawyers, have said this isn't what we asked for and sort of pull out of it and urge that it be sent back to the Supreme Court. And I think after a lot of conversation, some of it very intense, we all decided that getting civil union was better than getting nothing, and that if we refused to accept that as the plaintiffs, we might end up with nothing. So it was not an easy decision, because there were those in the room who said, no, this is not marriage.
Yep.
Let's say it isn't, and walk away from it.
Mm-hmm. But it felt important just after 3 years of work to walk away with something, and there was a tangible change that was available July 1st, 2000.
And then to jump the 9 years to when Vermont, through the legislature, created marriage, it's important to remember that Vermont was not the first state to have gay marriage. That was Massachusetts, through the Superior Court of Massachusetts. Vermont was the first state to have same-sex marriage through legislation. So in a way, during the Freedom to Marry lawsuit, 3 years, there were signs all over Vermont, take it to the people, which meant that shouldn't be a court decision. The people should decide, with the thought that, of course, the people would say no. Well, when the legislature then said yes 9 years later, the legislature is the voice of the people. So the people, in my mind, had spoken at that point.
There are also a lot of signs out there, too, saying Take Back Vermont.
Yes.
What did you two think of the whole Take Back Vermont movement?
Well, the joke was that it was put up by Cabot Cheese, so that you'd take
maple
cheese,
syrup,
so that tourists who came would buy cheese and take it back. So either cheese or maple syrup. What did I think? It also depended on what part of Vermont you were in. There were parts of Vermont where there were so many more of those Take Back Vermont signs. I think we had such support that it sort of offset that, but I think had I lived in a part of Vermont where I was surrounded by those signs, it probably would have been disquieting and unsettling. What do you think?
I agree with that. It really, we, to a certain extent, we're in a sort of Chittenden County bubble where there was mostly support, not universal support. I remember being behind a truck that had a Take Back Colchester bumper sticker, and part of me thought, well, you can have Colchester.
No offense to all of our Colchester friends,
Right.
whom we have many of now. So
Yeah. Was 9 years too long to get to where Vermont finally got?
boy, it's sort of, Mark, looking back, it feels like no time at all. But then it felt like a long time. I guess my response is probably not very helpful. It is what it is. Was what it was. And the wheels kept turning, and so there was Obergefell, and then there was what we did in Vermont. And I think it was part then. I think Vermont never stopped leading the way in my mind. So could it have happened faster? Probably, but it took the time it took.
Right after civil unions, I think the count is something like 25 lawmakers lost their seats.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
How did you feel about that? How did you feel towards those lawmakers? How did you feel about the political system?
Certainly felt a debt of gratitude, and Freedom to Marry was very involved in campaigning for pro-civil union candidates in the fall of 2000, and it was upsetting. It was sad to see people who had been so invested in their jobs as legislators lose their seats.
I think the Freedom to Marry Task Force and the people involved in the Freedom to Marry lawsuit we did a lot of talking about campaigning for those people and then helping them get reelected 2 or more years hence, and many of them did.
We actually, I went door to door to get petition signatures for Tom Little, who is a Republican, was a Republican at least then, and I went to a neighbor's door here in our complex and knocked on the door, and this very long delay, and this very elderly man shuffled to the door, and I said I was, collecting signatures for Tom Little, who was running for re-election to the House of Representatives, and he said, well, what party is he from? And I said, well, he's a Republican. And he said, oh, well, I'm a Democrat. And I said, well, I'm a Democrat too, but right now I think it's really important we support this Republican.
We had a fundraising party for Tom here in our house, just because those people, I've always wanted allies who support civil union and gay marriage and gay equality in general to know how grateful gay or queer people are to straight allies or non-queer allies, because it gave great comfort and great strength to us to have that kind of support.
You two got married.
Yep.
How did it change things for you two?
Well, it was lovely. One thing that happens many times when people get married is it's a sort of joining of the families, and we both had all kinds of extended family come together, and in some cases meet each other for the first time. And you're standing in a space, could be a church, could be a park, whatever, and you have a circle of people who support you and say, yes, we're glad this is happening, and we want to help you make this work. And I think that previous to this, we would have really been denied that opportunity.
We had 2 ceremonies. We had the civil union ceremony, which was held at the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Burlington on August 13th of 2000, standing room only. And it was quite amazing to be recognized both civilly and in a religious space as a married couple. It was civil union, but I'm kind of agree with the people who said, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. I always think of that as our wedding.
We had the Mendelssohn wedding march played when we walked out.
Right.
People laughed, but it was sort of
it was
meant to be humorous, but also just a little sort of jab.
It was very powerful, and I did feel different afterwards. Then 10 years later, we decided, because so many queer couples have a proliferation of anniversaries, we got married on August 13th, 10 years later, in our backyard in a very small ceremony that was officiated by Martha Dyson, who was a priest at the cathedral then, and just, maybe 15 people out there or 20 people?
About 25.
So we have the same anniversary for both things.
That makes it a little bit easier.
It
right?
does, absolutely.
When you look back on this experience, getting involved in this, what do you think?
I'm going to speak to something that is unique to me in that it carries my name. So it's the Baker decision, and my last name is Baker, and we've always said that's because I was first alphabetically, and it was simple to spell. And there was also a not a Baker case, but a Barker case in the history of marriage lawsuits. So being Baker, I remember one time walking into the legislature, and Elizabeth Reedy, who was then a senator, said, pulled me by the hand and took me around the room saying, "This is Baker." And I remember thinking it was fine that Elizabeth did that. She and I were friends. I'd known her in Addison County. But I thought, I am a person. But it also made me realize that my name carries meaning. And I had a friend who was in law school at one point write or email and say, "We just got to Baker in the textbook." So I've had to learn that my last name Baker, has meaning beyond who I am as a person, and yet the two are integrally combined. So I have that element as well. That's not really an answer to your question.
Yeah, no, actually, it is. How do you feel about that?
I say with my students, because I work with young people, anytime elections come around, I always talk about the importance of voting, and I go back to the year 2000 when I went to the town hall and voted that year. I knew everyone that I voted for personally, and I had been hugged by many of them. And I think Vermont is a special place in that respect, that there really is not that much distance between you and anyone in our government, and it's important to stand up for what you believe in and push through and try to be heard.
And you'll remember, I was going to joke and say, as long as people spell Peter's last name correctly, that he's happy. Because often people think it's Harrington because that's such a Vermont name instead of Harrigan. We need to remember also to go back to the process that the marriage in Vermont had to survive a gubernatorial veto. And
in 2009.
In 2009, not the civil union, but the actual marriage bill, and that was fairly intense. I mean, we were in the legislate in the thing when that vote was being taken, and we were all, we being the plaintiffs and others, tallying it as it went, and finally we got over that 2/3 mark, and I think by one vote, I believe.
Very close.
Wow, was it really that close?
It was that close. I mean, it was a 2/3 majority, but it was only one vote over 2/3 to survive that, to void that veto. So there, it never felt like a sure thing, until it was completely done.
Now, maybe correct me if I'm not remembering this right. That was Jim Douglas.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So then we have to give kudos to Governor Dean, who at least signed it in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that was behind closed doors.
Behind closed doors,
which he got some grief for, but
he did.
And did you feel that grief was justified, or
no? Well, is it justified? People are allowed to have the feelings they have, and
well, what are your feelings?
I feel he signed it. That's the important thing. Sure, it would have been nice if he'd had a big signing ceremony with all, with Bill Lippert and others there and all of us there. But the important thing is that it got signed into law.
Mm-hmm. I think the real sort of lasting moment came many years later, I think in 2017, when they put that plaque on the State House lawn referring to both the court case and then the legislative process, and I think that's sort of the enduring thing that maybe we had hoped for in 2000, but it took a while to actually get it.
I was thinking exactly the same thing, that the day that we went when the sign was unveiled was very, one of those beautiful Vermont sunny days with the Capitol right there, and the sign is very close to the Supreme Court, so it has a lot of significance that way.
Mm-hmm.
How have we evolved in 25 years as a society? Do you feel more accepted? Have we made a lot of progress, little progress? How would you describe that?
Well, I'd like to back up. One of the things that I often say is that in Vermont, we have sometimes a distorted view of how wonderful we are. And I think many people in Vermont would have said back in 97, 98, Vermont's this very liberal place and there's no homophobia here. Well, when the lawsuit was filed, it took the lid off of that. And of course, there's homophobia here, just as there's racism here, that we all carry internalized shadows of this stuff. So in a way, taking the lid off that illusion that there was no homophobia in Vermont, I think, while it created some difficult times, did a service to Vermont in making us as a state face that homophobia, internalized or otherwise. And I think we grew from that. Because as we've said, and it's not to be glib, people thought the sky would fall, the sky didn't fall. Same opposite-sex marriages are still happening. Same-sex marriages are still happening. The institution of marriage is still, I think, strong. So I think Vermont learned a lot and grew in that. Now we're facing a political climate where there are those who are going to be in power who say one of their goals is to overturn Obergefell. I've heard some people, prognosticators, say, well, the worst thing that could happen is there will be no more gay marriages going forward, but those who have them will keep them. And that, to me, is very disturbing, to end something with the promise that those who have it get to keep it. Do I think that's going to happen? I hope not. We'll certainly work hard to make sure that it doesn't. I think there would be huge resistance nationally now to a change like that.
Peter, do you think that's going to happen?
It's hard to say. I think a lot of people were surprised that Roe v. Wade was overturned, but then it was overturned.
Good point.
We actually, the day after that was officially announced, we went to Beth Robinson's installation as a circuit court judge. And so maybe...
Federal judge.
Yeah, maybe smaller seeds get planted in 10 years. Things are better than they were, but it certainly leaves us in an uncertain moment now.
Yeah, this is an interesting time we're in. There certainly is a feeling of great intolerance out there on a number of different levels.
I think people who are homophobic or misogynistic or whatever, or racist, have been given permission to voice that in a way that it wasn't happening before. And the reality is those people were always feeling like that. They just weren't speaking it. So perhaps there's something that is important in people speaking that, so that it becomes obvious, it becomes uncovered, you see it. So we're not sort of living in any kind of delusion that those things don't exist.
Last question. The Baker decision was important because...
Because of access. It gave people things that they didn't have before that. I think it's very practical on some level, because there were couples in our state who didn't have access to over 300 laws that somehow involved marriage, and after that, they did. It took a while to truly get that, but something changed as a result.
Well, I think it's from that point of view, it's important in terms of access to one's spouse when they're sick, in the hospital, all kinds of inheritance things, all kinds of rights that people don't even think about. I remember right after civil union being advised, remember there are still states that don't have this, so make sure you take all of your paperwork with you when you cross state lines, that sort of thing. And that was a very strange thing. So having it federally recognized made it feel safer in many ways. So I think there's an element of safety, there's an element of acceptance, and there's an element of education. And we've always known that one reason that people are queasy is, particularly I think with male couples, is they seem to go right to the bedroom in terms of where their mind goes. And I think what people may have learned is that same-sex couples are pretty boring. That we do the same things they do. We get up and have breakfast and wash the dishes and clean the house and watch TV at night or whatever, that sort of thing. So
argue about who gets the choice tonight of which movie to watch.
Exactly. So it's that we are more alike than we are different, and I think that's perhaps not exciting but important. That people realize the similarities in people that they see as different rather than the differences.
That wraps it up for another edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.